where once again we find ourselves enormously grateful to the Parliamentary Conservative Party for ensuring that the days of us not knowing what on earth we would be able to talk about on air feel 100 years away. They're at it again. It's just surreal. A circular firing squad where everybody's managed to miss everybody else, as far as I can tell, and where 30p Lee Anderson has turned out to be a hysterical flouncing half-wit, as the inimitable Ian Dunt put it this morning on Twitter. I mean, who knew? Who could possibly have looked at that sage of our time, that model of empathy and insight, and thought to themselves, I bet he turns out to be a hysterical flouncing half-wit. But here we are. And of course he wasn't alone. The other fella with the hyphen, Brendan Clarke-something, he has resigned as well. How many deputy chairmans are there? How many deputy chairmans of the Conservative Party does it take to change a light bulb? I haven't got a punchline for that joke. But I don't know how many deputy chairmen or chairpersons of the Conservative Party there actually are. Does anybody know? Is it like one of those things at the fair? When you have all the marbles in a jar, all the jelly beans in a jar, do you get a prize if you can count all the deputy chairpersons of the Conservative Party? You get a bottle of pomaine. Is that still a thing? And then you come to the rebellion, which isn't going to happen as far as I can tell. It will be, as far as I can tell, and according to my clever colleague upstairs, there's quite a strong chance that the rebellion won't reach double figures later today. The number of people actually voting against the bill that will send the so-called Rwanda bill to or rather voting in favour of the amendments, will struggle to reach double figures, which means the whole thing goes to its third reading unmolested, unchallenged, unchanged. So what an almighty mess. And we could laugh about it. And obviously we will laugh about it, but we laugh with a sense of sadness. For two reasons. The first is, if you believe in parliamentary democracy, and if you are even pretending to be patriotic, you have to profess faith in parliamentary democracy. It's very sad to see a party in such parlous condition. I mean, truly sad to see. Albeit that they all deserve it, there must still be a few people on the Conservative benches who are grimacing in horror at what their party has become. We know, because we talk about it quite often on the programme, that there are plenty of people who have, and in some cases continue to consider themselves Conservative supporters, who grimace and clench their buttocks daily in horror at what their party has become. A party where 30p Lee Anderson and Brendan Clarke-something can both be described as senior Tories. Just let that sink in. I hate it when people say just let that sink in, but sometimes, like once a year, I think it works. Could you imagine that part? So in 2019, people like David Gauke and Dominic Grieve, Rory Stewart, Nicholas Soames, they all left the Conservative Party. And people like 30p Lee and Brendan Clarke-something and Jonathan Hulis, they all came in to the Conservative Party. That would be a bit like taking, I don't know, let's not go Ronaldo, Messi and Lineker levels of substitution, but it would be like taking Premier League footballers off the park and replacing them with people from the National League South, wouldn't it? Actually, that's not fair on the National League South. If we've still got the Beezer Homes League, what's below? Well, it'd be Sunday morning football. From your kids' Sunday morning football team. It'd be like taking Premier League. This is what the Conservative Party did after Dominic Johnson and Boris Cummings undertook their putsch, their cull, their purge. They removed parliamentarians from the parliamentary party who I didn't agree with them about much, except probably the idiocy of Brexit in most of those cases. But they removed parliamentarians who were Premier League standard by any measure, and they replaced them with people who would struggle to get in to a Sunday morning pub team. And within 4 years, the people who would struggle to get into a Sunday morning pub team are being described by client journalists as senior Tories. What an extraordinary mess Rishi Sunak has presided over. Now, I don't know what question to ask you this morning. We have already done what are they playing at with regard to the Rwanda bill. I saw a reminder on Twitter yesterday that the bill, I haven't double-checked the dates, but I've got no reason to doubt it. I can't remember who it was that said it, but it was definitely someone who I consider to be reliable. I think the Rwanda bill was only introduced by Boris Johnson the day after the Sue Gray report came out. So it sort of gave right-wing media something else to stick on their front pages or something else to talk about because of the Sue Gray report being simultaneously, of course, a damp squib and also a terrible conspiracy designed to undermine the greatest prime minister this country has ever seen. So I'm pretty sure it was never intended to come to this, because the thing about Boris Johnson, and I don't think this is an exaggeration or an embellishment, I think Boris Johnson could just never have mentioned it again. I genuinely believe that. Well, you know and I know that, as with Donald Trump, who we talked about a bit yesterday, that there is no depth to which these people will not stoop. That there is no unpleasantness or example of moral corruption that would be beneath them. There's nothing beneath them. You can go no lower than a Trump or a Johnson. And therefore, I think that having successfully thrown the dead cat of the idea of deporting people to a country where opponents of the government are still locked up, kidnapped and tortured, deporting genuine asylum seekers, not failed asylum seekers, deporting them there, processing their applications and then leaving them there for the rest of their life. I don't think it was ever supposed to happen. It's a bit, from Boris Johnson's point of view, it's a bit like Brexit. It was never actually supposed to happen. It was designed entirely as an exercise in self-interest. Oh, my God. Isn't that an interesting parallel? It was never supposed to happen, folks. It was just an exercise in self-interest. It was an exercise in self-protection or self-promotion. What's the best thing I can do at the moment? Well, the best thing I can do at the moment is to pretend that I think Brexit is a good idea, because that will enhance my chances of becoming Prime Minister when the Remain side win and I battle against George Osborne for the leadership of the Conservative Party after David Cameron has resigned. Of the many stupid things David Cameron has done, letting it be known that he was going to resign in the event of winning that election in 2015 was probably among the stupidest. And then you have, a few years later, when his government was facing, well, when his position was becoming untenable, when he had already endured, or rather committed many acts that would have ended most political careers, the one that really did feel like a ticking time bomb suddenly got louder with the publication of the Sue Gray report. They came out that week and said, we're going to deport boat people to Rwanda. And I say to you today, I don't think that he ever intended it to happen. I think his intention was to mention it a few times and then pretend he never had. And do you know what's really interesting? I think he would have got away with it because people like the Three Musketeers and Jonathan Gullis had a kind of, I don't know what word to use really. Let's just say cultish. A cultish regard for Boris Johnson. You know, in the way that we talked about Trump yesterday and how previously sensible politicians have sacrificed any vestiges of integrity at the altar of his cultish status. Well, you know, we're kind of short of sensible MPs, but the likes of 30p Lee and Brendan Clark something and Jonathan Grunt, they kind of had, I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was a sort of weird class-based deference in that they honestly thought Boris Johnson was somehow better than them because of the way that he talked or the school that he went to. Do you know that Gullis once said that when he was a teacher, he used to model his persona on Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg, and they let him near children? Can you believe that? Someone modelling themselves on Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg was allowed to exercise influence over young minds. It's quite terrifying, really, in many ways. But that is my theory. That is my answer to the question of how the heck did this happen, is that the Rwanda proposal, the Rwanda idea, was never supposed to be law. It was never supposed to be a proper policy. It was about as accurate and as honest as the claim that they'd built 40 new hospitals or that he'd got all the big calls right. In fact, file it in the same box as getting all the big calls right and building 40 new hospitals. It was just something to say, not something to do. The essence of Boris Johnson, really, was something to say, not something to do. I never lied to the House of Commons. I built 40 hospitals. I got all the big calls right. I got Brexit done. Don't examine the reality or the facts of what I'm claiming. Just do it. So I think the question I want to ask you is, how much of this is Rishi Sunak's fault and how much of it was utterly unavoidable? The mess that he finds himself in today, he has ended up being a Prime Minister for whom the departure of Lee Anderson from his government is being reported as bad news in right-wing newspapers. I can't imagine there has ever been a room from which Lee Anderson has departed without everybody else in it, at the very least breathing a sigh of relief and quite possibly breaking out in a spontaneous round of applause. But Lee Anderson leaves the Conservative government, and that is apparently bad news for Rishi Sunak. So how has this happened? 0345 6060 973. How has this ludicrous Rwanda brain fart of Boris Johnson's ended up hobbling the Tory party in the most spectacular and public way? But the question perhaps that might be even more interesting, and I can tell you now, it'd be quite easy to get through in the first few minutes of this conversation because these are quite nebulous questions and that they often take a little bit more thinking. But you obviously have to do the thinking. How much of this is Rishi Sunak's fault? How much of this has he brought upon himself? And I think we can all reliably describe it as a mess. How much of this mess has Rishi Sunak brought upon himself? And how much of it has essentially been done unto him? Because I don't know. I'm not suggesting for a moment that you conjure up any scintilla of sympathy for Rishi Sunak. The man he's a blancmange. He's a blancmange in curiously short trousers. But I don't know what else he could have done, having inherited a Boris Johnson-flavoured gimmick. So how much of the Rwanda mess is Rishi Sunak's fault? Hit the numbers now. You will get through. 0345 6060 973. I suppose technically he hasn't left the government. He's left the deputy chairman of the party. Is that a government role? It's a party role, isn't it, Rob? But you know what I mean. Say Rishi Sunak's team. He's quit Rishi Sunak's team. And then I am interested in the question of how such... Is the word pygmy offensive? I suppose it probably is if you're using it as a pejorative because it describes real people. So I won't use that word. But how can such flotsam and jetsam, how can so many obviously stupid people have ended up exercising influence over the Conservative Party? One of the ugliest things about the British class system is very posh people who enjoy enormous privilege thinking that a knuckle-dragger like Lee Anderson somehow represents working class interests. He doesn't represent working class interests any more than Jacob Rees-Mogg is anti-establishment. It's absolutely extraordinary the way that posh people use the worst possible examples of people from humbler backgrounds as exemplars of what everybody from the so-called working class must be like. Angela Rayner is working class, and you wouldn't catch her spouting the kind of zero IQ bilge that 30p Lee comes out with on a daily basis. But how have they ended up? Gullis on with Ferrari this morning, effectively demanding that Rishi Sunak invites him round for tea. How have these Johnny-come-latelys, with the political acumen of a Pepperami, how have they ended up feeling as if they exercise genuine influence over the body politic, not just over the Conservative Party, but over the country? Absolutely unbelievable. So there's a bunch of questions there. Come at it from any angle you like. How much of this is Rishi Sunak's fault? And I don't know whose answer to that is most interesting, the Conservative supporter or the Conservative rejecter. Let's find out. You're all welcome. 0345 6060 973. Number 2 is... how have people like Brendan Clarke-Something and 30p Lee ended up in positions of apparent influence in your party or in the party and in our country? I've got an answer to that, but I've detained you for long enough with this introduction. 0345 6060 973. And number 3, which knits both questions together. How have they ended up with this absolute pudding of a policy being so stupid and so daft that it was supposed to hurt the Labour Party, the Rwanda policy? Or was it? Was it just supposed to give Boris Johnson one news cycle when the Partygate report wouldn't be leading news bulletins? But, they see it as something with which to hurt the Labour Party. And yet all it's done is turn the Parliamentary Conservative Party into a circular firing squad that can't even get a shot on target.